Well, thanks for having me here today. It truly is an honor and a privilege to come to K-State. Of course, a tremendous peer institution for us at Texas Tech. Many colleagues, former students working here on the faculty. So we have many collaborations going, and I genuinely appreciate and am humbled by the opportunity to be here. So with that being said, I don't want to delay this too much further. You'll find through my presentation I have a lot of animations like the one that you see going here, and that's to pique your interest, but also to say that, just a picture says 1,000 words, and maybe even more than that. Some of the best ways for me to demonstrate to you what we're working on is through these images or videos, and so hopefully they continue to work throughout the presentation, and I'll get around to describing this better here in a moment. The concept of yield grade is an old concept, so I don't really have to introduce that to you, but I will briefly, just to remind you as to where we've been, and then also discuss where we're going. So yield grade is a numerical system from 1 to 5. We have this based on the idea that these categories of yield grade, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, help us to describe what we call boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts, or saleable yield, red meat yield, ultimately edible portion from beef cattle. And obviously there's value to that, because not every pound of hot carcass weight, not every pound, Dr. Dykman, of live weight is equal. The composition is very different, and so we must find a way to value that differently. Now I want you to camp out here just for a second and think about, why do we have to do that? Why do we need to send a signal back to cattle producers, to cattle feeders, to say that not all pounds are created equal? Because if we don't, then we end up going in the wrong direction. And I'm going to make a really bold statement. We've been going in the wrong direction for a long time, okay? And we've been misled and misguided by this yield grading system. And the reason is it's inaccurate, okay? So we have to fix it. So as many of you know, and you probably took an ASI course at K-State in 1965, this concept, and in fact you used exactly the same equation. And therein lies the problem, because if you don't think cattle have changed since 1960, then you've been laying under a rock for a long time, okay? So here's the idea, another video on the bottom, around 1997, 1998. Some really critical changes started to occur with technology. We used camera grading systems. In the late 90s and early 2000s, we began to measure ribeye area and fat thickness with these camera grading systems, and that added a lot of accuracy and repeatability to the measurement of ribeye area and fat thickness, which made us better at yield grading, okay? So that's a good thing. Of course, this camera also has capability of determining marbling score. That was later approved in 2006, but that's not our discussion today. We could make a whole nother talk about that and several talks and going on about that technology and what it does. The problem was, even though we were a lot better at measuring ribeye area and fat thickness, the equation we were putting those numbers into wasn't working. And that's what the first part of this demonstration is about, is how bad was it? Well, again, here's a reminder, in picture says 1,000 words here. Charlie Murphy, 1960, in fact, he did this research in 1958, Michael, right? And he didn't publish it until 1960, and then USDA implemented it in 1962. So 1958 model cattle, okay? Most of you weren't born in 58, some of you were, but you were really young, right? And this is what the cattle looked like. And this was a good one, mind you, right? And we had Herefords and Angus predominantly, and of course, cattle have changed a great deal. And it's just simply asinine, for lack of better words, for us to continue to use an equation that was based on cattle that looked like that were compositionally similar to those Hereford and Angus cattle. So here's some data, and I don't mean to bore you with this, but it's pretty profound to think that calculated yield grade related to subprimal yield on an individual animal basis explains 4% of the true variation in subprimal yield in yield grade. It just doesn't work. we've grown distantly apart from the accuracy of yield grade. That's if we use the equation just generically across the population. Well, we said, well, can we help the equation out a little bit? Can we rebuild the equation and tell it whether these are conventional beef animals, beef on dairy crossbred animals, or Holsteins, and we do in fact get better, right? If we tell the equation what the type of animal we have, then it does a better job predicting that subprimal yield, but still only to the tune of 39% R-square, or variance explained 26 and 19% for conventional beef on dairy and Holsteins respectively. How many of your K-State students? What happens when you get a 39 on your test? No bueno, right? It's not good. So in no way is this performance acceptable from an academic standard or just a standard in general. And the analogy that I use here is this is like going to the gas station and pumping gas when you're paying for gas by the gallon, dollars per gallon, and you're getting charged, but it's not accurate. I may be getting 9/10 of a gallon. I may be getting 1.1 gallon for the gallon that I'm paying for. Everybody kind of follow along with that? So it's to some extent immoral, unethical, and probably even illegal, right, to transact cattle in this fashion. How can we transact cattle on something that's so horribly inaccurate? So that really is the premise for what we're doing. And I see Brian's out here, other folks in here working on this group with NCBA, just trying to push this forward, okay? So the good news is if we can measure red meat yield accurately, we know that there's a really strong relationship between true red meat yield and true value. So when we take carcasses and we cut them up and we put them into a box, we sell them out to wholesalers, consumers, et cetera, we've got an 89% relationship between true red meat yield and true value, or saleable value. So these data just say, hey, we need to get to where we can do this accurately, and then it will mean something to us. Okay, so that's where we're headed. We need to do this more efficiently, more accurately. Well, here's what I started talking about earlier. We've been misguided and misdirected by economics. We've said to make cattle heavier at all costs. Heavier, heavier, heavier. And in that same discussion, right, we talk about dressing percentage. So when you talk to a feedlot operator about yield, that means dressing percentage. Do you know what the relationship between dressing percentage and red meat yield is? It's inverse, it's opposite. They go in opposite directions because absolutely the best way to improve dressing yield or dressing percentage is to make cattle fatter. So we have a very clear message to make cattle bigger, heavier, and fatter, which is completely contradictory to what we're asking for with USDA yield grade, which is leaner and heavier muscled. That's a problem. We have divergent signals economically, and what are producers going to do? They're going to do what makes more money, whether it's right, wrong, or even indifferent. So the signal, I dare to say, is wrong. And it's not only wrong for what we're putting in the box, but I think we could make a pretty good argument that it's unethical or immoral even. The fact that we're just continuously feeding these cattle to oblivion to produce a wasteful product. So just let that sink in for a second. Obviously, that's my opinion. I'll leave it there, okay? So the trend clearly over time, historically and especially of late, is to increase the number of 4s and 5s, to shrink the 1s and 2s. So now we're eroding from, shrinking yield grade 1s and 2s to dragging into the 3s and making a whole lot of 4s and 5s. Yield grade 4s and 5s are out of bounds, right? They are too fat for our industry in really any way that we want to talk about it. So at Texas Tech, how did we get into this discussion? What made it ever so clear to us? We have colleagues just north of us at West Texas A&M, particularly Ty Lawrence, who's been talking to, he's a former K-State, he's a Wildcatter, right? Worked with Dr. Dykeman here. But he's been saying for a long time, hey, yield grade doesn't work. Yield grade doesn't work. We agree. What about yield grade doesn't work? There's not enough muscle there. There's not enough muscle for what ribeye tells us there is in the carcass. And therein really lies the problem. So ribeye area is a very poor indicator of muscling in carcasses, particularly in Holstein type cattle. which today has been slowly or, well, rapidly replaced, but rapidly replaced with crossbreds. But did you know that today crossbreds make up 23.5% of the cattle mix? I mean, that's a big proportion. That's 1 out of 4, right, are coming off of dairy as an original origin. So we started doing a whole lot of beef on dairy work in 2018. We went down the road of looking at eating qualities and other traditional meat science things. And then we began to look specifically within this population, and we were studying phenotype. So let me just tell you that the 2 steers on the left were killed on the same day. They were from the same feedlot pen. They were actually from the same dairy. They had the same sire, and they were born in the same week. Okay, so these are contemporary animals. And even though they have the same sire and all of that background is the same, they look this different, right? And this is just demonstrating to us that genetics combine in many different combinations. And we get both ends of the spectrum, right? Dr. Moger's here somewhere. I talked to him earlier. We've had lots of discussions about this topic. But inevitably, we will have this variation in our cattle population, even when we control so many other things. So then we began to study these populations of crossbred cattle, and we have over 930-something head in this study. We ended up categorizing them in what we called phenotypic groups. So what you see in the phenotypic groups along the bottom, the number 1 phenotypic group on the far left is a dairy-like animal. The one on the far right, phenotype group 4, is a beef-like animal. And then we have the phenotypes in between that represent intermediate phenotypes. So we were studying these groups and we bucketed them on phenotype to understand, 1, if eating quality was different. It wasn't. 2, if red meat yield was different. It was. Okay, so that's what we began looking at in these populations. If you didn't know, a lot of the beef on dairy work has really taken us leaps and bounds ahead for our entire industry because we're able to study in a controlled fashion a lot of contemporary cattle. So it's a really good research tool. Well, if we take a look at these cattle in 4 phenotypic groups at arrival at the feedlot, reimplant stage, when we could reimplant, and harvest stage, then we understand that these cattle, even though they look that different, they weigh the same. Their weight, their body mass was the same. Not only was it statistically not significantly different, but they're almost identical from a numerical sense. So we are putting weight on these animals with very different proportion and priority. The reality is we're putting a lot more weight in the skeleton of the dairy-like animal, and we're putting a lot more weight in the form of fat and muscle in the beef-like animal. So the composition clearly changes. So as you can see here, those fully dairy type, right, phenotype, all the way to the fully beef type on the table on the top are represented here. The live muscling scores were different. That's how we put them into the groups. So we expected that. Round muscling score, which was taken from their carcasses in the plant, was also different. So that live phenotype translated to carcass phenotype. Not a whole lot of rocket science there. But what we learned from this is ribeye area was not different. Across those 4 groups, irrespective of how poor or how good they looked on the hoof, ribeye area did not differ, okay? That's a problem, okay? That is a problem because we utilize ribeye area as the single indicator of muscling in proportion to weight in the yield grade equation. So when your indication of lean meat doesn't work, then how can you expect an equation that's intended to predict lean meat to work, or what we call red meat yield? So therein lies the problem. Here's a demo that we did. It's part of a symposia. We froze 2 steers. This was quite a fun exercise in our meat lab for a day or so. We took 2 animals that weighed the same, 2 animals that had the same fat thickness, almost the same ribeye area, nearly identical yield grade, same quality grade, and we're just demonstrating here that even though all of those factors match up, the composition is wildly, notably different. Now, many of you in the cattle industry are stockmen. You're judges, right? You can tell the difference in conformation and phenotype. And that is really what we're getting back to here. How do we judge overall animal muscling. Can we rely upon ribeye area? This says clearly no. 3% of the variation in subprimal yield, or what we're trying to predict, was explained by ribeye area. Only 3%. That means there is very little relationship between that single trait measurement and true carcass muscling. Now the question is did we create that? Did we create this by selecting for only ribeye area, allowing for round muscling and shoulder muscling and total animal muscling in sires and dams and progeny to drift apart? I think yes. I think with single trait selection, irrespective of true muscling, not only did we allow for this to happen, but we probably made it happen. And we made it happen pretty quick. So really interesting stuff here. More and more math here just shows the low relationships between the individual factors in yield grade, like back fat, which is actually one of the stronger relationships, explaining 39% of the variation in subprimal yield. Hot carcass weight, 36% as an independent measure, right? So we start gluing these things together and we are able to explain some of this relationship. But like I said earlier, 39, 36%, just not good enough for transacting cattle in today's market. More of the same here. I won't belabor the point. I think the point is being made here, obviously, that yield grade is broken because the individual factors no longer tell us what we want it to say, okay? And when we plug those back into the same equation developed by Charlie Murphy and others in 1960, or published in 1960, they just explain very little of what we're looking for. So the first and most obvious question is, well, why don't we just recreate the equation? Why don't we just make it new? Because we can do that. We have thousands, in fact, million upon million of data point, right, of carcass data. We have maybe 5,000 or 6,000 that actually have red meat yield data tied to it. So that's kind of hard to believe too. We've got 30 million data points a year on a camera that says what ribeye area was, fat thickness was, yield grade was. But each of those years we maybe have 1,000 head that we actually know what they yielded. Kind of a miss, right? And it's really hard to do that work. And that's part of this presentation as well. But nonetheless, when we fix the equation, this is new math. This is not the same equation you learned in 1965 at K-State or elsewhere. This is a new equation that we developed, and we get up to R-square values of about 0.63, meaning we can get to a D for diploma level. Okay, we can get to a D level, academically speaking, if we change the math. But there's no way for us truly to know that if that new equation works only on the 1,600 we redeveloped it with, if it actually works on the 30 million or the 25 million that we kill each year in a fed sense. So it's just a guess, right? But it does get better. So math can be improved, and we can improve these equations. And we've done several iterations of this, not only red meat yield, but cutout value. We're explaining somewhere between 35 and 40% of cutout value. Again, just low performing equations with old technologies and old measurements. So now what you're seeing here is that same video that played on the open slide. This is our first thought and concept as to how do we measure total carcass yield. So not just a one-dimensional measurement or two-dimensional measurement of square inches of ribeye, not just a fat thickness measurement and hot carcass weight. How do we get to a more holistic measurement, okay? So how do we get to that holistic measurement that you're seeing here in the 3D image, where we take a visual image that's appealing to us because we can tell what it is, and then turn that into data? The reality is every digital image, 2D or 3D, is data. It's a data cloud. And these pixels, right, have independent measurements tied to them. So what you really see when you see a digital image is millions of data points. So what we're doing is taking the digital image and we're turning it into data. And then from that, we can do computational statistics, which today we call machine learning. which most of us know on our phones is artificial intelligence. So this is artificial intelligence in so many ways in the types of models that we're using. Ultimately, we can take cross-sectional measurements like foreshank areas, foreshank perimeters, sirloin measurements, round measurement, chuck measurement, and we can get a more holistic measurement and use that in machine learning techniques to get our R-square up to like 90%. So these data would suggest that we can explain as much as 91% up to 96% of the variation. So now we've gone from a F to a D to something that is beginning to look like an A, academically speaking. And it just makes sense that with a more holistic measurement, we can be more accurate. So 3D imaging is a prediction tool. We still have to predict red meat yield with 3D imaging. This is CT scanning. And I won't ask you to raise your hand, but some of you in the audience have probably had a CT scan, right? So CT scanning technology, very prevalent in the medical industry, very similar to MRI. We'll talk about that here in just a second. But with CT, we can actually measure composition. So this is no longer a prediction tool, this is an absolute measurement. So from these data, we can tell you how much muscle, fat, and bone. We can tell you actually how much marbling is in these muscles as well. And so these are really, really good images. We would use this on every carcass if we could. We can't because it doesn't operate fast enough. So we can scan a carcass in, let's say, 10 minutes or so if we're going about it in an expedited fashion. But the fact of the matter is, at 400 head an hour, not even close. So we don't have the capacity with current CT technology to measure this on every carcass. What we have decided to try to do is to utilize CT scanning to train other technologies, which include 3D imagery and any other thing someone else could come up with, okay? So, but we can accurately measure with CT scans. We have CT scanned about 100 head in total now in our meat laboratories. We know that the concept works. Now we're going to use it to back calculate and build models like this. So what this is true artificial intelligence, okay? So we've taken CT scans, and if you look close enough, if you're sitting close enough, you can see them. You can see the slices on the bone. You can see the slices in the meat and in the muscle. So this image is built from about 78 independent slices off of a CT scanner. And so what my graduate student is doing, and he's much smarter than me, by the way, is rebuilding or reconstructing 3D imagery from CT scans. And this is done every day in the medical industry, but he's learned how to do it using ChatGPT, by the way. And he builds these, right, at his computer, just right next to me in a graduate student office. So let me rewind this as you kind of saw that play out. So what he's doing is rebuilding these. He's able to create a smoothing effect to make it look like a round that we see in a plant every day. And then he's able to subtract all of the tissue, add the bone back so he can quantify bone, and then he'll add back muscling. Now when you see the muscling, you can also see the voids where the fat goes back in, okay? So the seam fat and the muscle separations are there. He'll add back part of the fat to demonstrate what we see here. And then what you have to imagine with me, which is what we're working on now, is he can virtually cut this round. So we don't have to have a knife anymore. We just have to have a CT scan, and he can, with a computer technology, cut the round, just like they do at any packing plant in the United States. He can cut it not only into an inside round, a knuckle, a bottom round, but he can trim it to a 1/2 inch, a 1/4 inch, an 1/8 inch, a 1/10 inch, and 0 inch, a whole lot better than we can. So these data become the gold standard. And with this type of data, not only will we be able to estimate red meat yield, but we will be able to tell you ideally what the inside round should weigh, what the ribeye roll should weigh, how many steaks it'll make at 1 inch, how many steaks it'll make at 10 ounce. Like, this is unbelievable technology. If we could actually CT scan them all, That's a possibility, and that's what we're working on now. That is, in fact, the gold standard. In order to do this, you have to have 1,000 upon 1,000 of individual units. AI models require a lot of data. That's a problem, because we can get into a packing plant on a Saturday and we can run all day long, and we might get 100 head scanned and cut, right, to develop these models. So how do we do that? What this concept is showing you is what we call digital twinning or data augmentation. So we can take an actual carcass on the left and we can create a new carcass in the middle. And with the created carcass in the middle, we actually know what the red meat yield is. So we can artificially create millions of carcasses that don't actually exist from maybe several hundred. Right, so we have several hundred carcasses that are real. We can make several million that are fake, for lack of better words. But those fake carcasses give us the data that we need to build these models. This is artificial intelligence. And in fact, most of you kids in here, and grandparents or parents with kids, have seen Pixar movies, right? This is exactly how Pixar works. So they take bulls, they take kitties, and they take dogs and lions, and they make these images of them, and then they just recreate them in different moods and different activities. I want a frolicking, happy lion, and then I want a really angry lion. They do that by taking pictures of lions that are walking, running, frolicking, mad, happy, sad, and then they recreate them with animations, and that's what this is. Kind of freaky stuff. But nonetheless, we are using these same concepts to create new carcasses, because the fact of the matter is we just can't ever get enough of them. So we have to digitally create them. And so we live in a new era. Like this stuff is mind-blowing. I'm a meat scientist. I have no business, right, creating this stuff, but now it's possible. Because I have really smart graduate students who know how to use AI. And this is what's going on in our shop, in our meat laboratory, of all places. So here's MRI. Most of you are familiar, again, a very similar technology to CT. The difference here is that MRI is really good with soft tissues. So here we can talk about silver skins, we can talk about ligaments. We actually get a much clearer image with MRI. Yeah, if you haven't noticed yet, that's a short loin, and it's cutting porterhouses and T-bones 1 millimeter at a time. And so we could literally do this with every part of the carcass. It's magical. Like, I don't even have to explain it to you. You can see what we can do here. And then we can remove the fat, we can remove the ligaments, all of those things. And we get very, very accurate, like to the 0.1% of composition with these types of measurements. The problem is, again, there are limitations here. One, MRI is expensive. Two, it's slow. And in the way that it works, we'd have a really hard time getting a carcass in an MRI platform and getting it scanned effectively at any kind of speed. So even though they work, they're too slow, so on and so forth. Now here's a faster technology. Here's a technology that they use quite a lot in New Zealand and Australia. This is called iDXA scanning. Has anybody had an iDXA scan? Has anybody flown in an airplane? Then you've had an iDXA scan, okay? So most of you probably have. When you walk in and you do this, this is what they see. But they've got it dialed down, so they don't see your butt and your feet and all that. They just see a shadow, and anything that's hard in your pocket or any kind of weapon, they might be able to see that, but it's all a setting, right? They can set it with greater intensity and then, in fact, see X-ray type data. This is, in fact, a bone density scanner, okay? It's made for detecting osteoporosis and diagnosing that in the population. But it can also measure muscularity and fat and BMI and all of these things. So there's a lot of models. This is also utilized a lot in swine growth and development research, so it's not a new thing to animal science. We use a similar concept, both CT, well, I say both, all three, CT, MRI, and iDXA scanning measure density. So we separate muscle, fat, and bone based on density. That's what it's measuring with X-ray rays or X-ray technology, okay? And so from that, we utilize this distribution of density to segregate muscle, fat, and bone. And ultimately, we can get to about a 74% accuracy with the good old airport scanner, right, on a beef carcass. That's what these data are demonstrating. So we can get higher levels of accuracy in somewhat of a rapid scan with this type of technology. In addition to that, if you can visualize with me, as we move into an era of robotics, then we can also guide robotic knives and saws and tools using this type of technology. So this replaces the human eye, the human hand, if we are in fact going to fabricate beef or other species using robotics. Okay, now we're getting closer to the producer level. So how do we make improvement? I dare to say that the biggest improvement that will be made by accurately assessing red meat yield of livestock is the fact that now we can accurately assess and breed livestock using genomics and genetics that are actually higher in red meat yield, not just with larger ribeye. How have we increased ribeye area so effectively? How have we increased intramuscular fat or marbling so effectively, specifically in the last 30 years? How do you think that came about? Data sharing. Data sharing from camera grading systems. So now you didn't have to pay KSU graduate students to go out and collect carcass data. Now you just download it by the thousand, right? Every animal you killed in 2024, you've got every ribeye area and every marbling score. And if you're doing progeny testing, now you have something to work with, okay? So data sharing, accurate data translates to much more rapid and accurate genetic selection and improvement. So we can actually catapult the industry forward with really accurate and abundant data if the packers share it. And that's always the caveat, right? So you have to have that relationship. You have to have access to that data to make those improvements, and that will come, okay? So how do we make these selections on bulls? How do we make this selection in the feedlot? Well, the closest technology that we're aware of today to a 3D image scan is this SIZAR technology. And so it's using radar, millimeter radar technology to create a shell of the live animal. And you can see that happening here. So as the animals pass through the chute on the left-hand side, we're taking radar scans, and so we're building that shell. No matter how fast the animal moves through the chute, it can build a shell. And so this three-dimensional figure, you can make out on one end, this is the shoulder on the left, the top line, the rib cage, the hip and pin set on the back. And so we're getting similar measurements to a 3D scan that is going to start building as a tool for selection of seed stock and also being utilized in progeny test. Now, I'm not going to get really into the details here, but this is actually a dairy cow that was scanned. So as she moves through on the left, you can actually see her chest floor or brisket develop and then her udder develop as she moves through the chute. It's a very accurate technology to build a three-dimensional shell. All right, so now I'm going to get off into the clouds and the weeds a little bit, so I better check off my time here. All right, I got all kinds of time. I can slow down and breathe a little bit. Here's the question. Why are we feeding cattle longer? Why are we increasing days on feed? Why are we making cattle fatter? What do you think the number one answer is? Well, they're paying me to do it. That's exactly right. But why would packers incentivize that? There's a variety of reasons. More total pounds per animal, right? So there's a lot of fixed cost in meat packing. And those fixed costs are largely dependent upon an individual animal. When I run an individual animal through a harvest floor or through a processing floor, I figure my cost on a per animal basis. My chilling capacity based on a per animal basis, right? So all of these things come into play here. But why do we want cattle to be fed longer? Why are we getting them fatter? Why do we feel good about getting them fatter? Because it's producing marbling, right? And we're meeting the demand for prime and upper two-thirds choice and choice beef, right? That's one of the main driving theories and concepts behind getting cattle fatter. So if we look at these data, and these data are astounding in multiple ways. This is based on 5 million head, right, computed by CAB. So Daniel Clark at CAB and I worked together on these data. And so they took all of the CAB graded or A-stamp cattle over the course of 2023 down to 2019, and he crunched those numbers. What this says is the average amount of back fat, this is preliminary yield grade or 12th rib fat, for a 900-pound carcass, so he adjusted for weight, to reach a marbling score of 500. So this is a premium choice carcass. These are the average back fat, so half are above and half are below this number. In 2023, 3,900s. That's not a lot. It's actually very low, right? 3,900s for 2 consecutive years. We're getting better. The data that the Angus Association talks about is we're getting better with genetics. We're actually producing more marbling with less fat. Great. I agree with that. Genetics are the most powerful tool we deal with. My bigger question is why in the hell are we putting an inch of fat on them if they're going to have modest marbling score at 4/10? So what proportion of the population are we feeding well beyond, right, their genetic capacity for marbling? We're just feeding them to feed them. We're just making them fat to make them heavy, right? So this is good evidence that we don't have to do that and that genetics is a phenomenal tool. What these data show is all of the data he has plotted by marbling score and back fat in inches. What these data suggest is that once we hit 66/100ths of an inch of fat, 6,500, 66/100ths, then marbling increases, but at a decreasing rate. So these data would suggest that feeding them beyond 6,500ths is pointless. Okay? And then even more so, beyond 9/10 is just not only pointless, it's ignorant. Okay? And the percentage of cattle over 6,500ths, dare I say, is 45%. Over 9/10 is over 20% today. So that just gives you some perspective. So why are we doing this? Because we have a broken system. We have a system that doesn't tell us accurately what we should be producing, so we're just producing weight and fat into oblivion. This is a problem. This is a sustainability problem. It's a water problem. It's a corn problem. It's a tillable acres problem. It's a processing problem. It's huge. And honestly, we should be ashamed we're doing it as an industry. And that's a very strong statement, and I believe it wholeheartedly. We have got to fix this because we can no longer stand on 2 legs and tell people we're doing the right thing if we're not doing the right thing. Okay, so this is a remedy. This is a fix to improve this. This is just more fun fact for you. 2023 consist data, 10% select, 9.2% prime. We're kicking tail, right? I mean, the industry is doing exceptionally well from a marbling score standpoint. Now we're almost matching average and high choice, or we're actually overproducing upper 2/3 choice relative to low choice. So today's targets are no longer choice. Today's target are premium choice and prime. And in fact, the most progressive producers are chasing prime as a statistic, not choice in any form or fashion, right? So it's a really cool game that we're playing here. In 2022 and 23, nearly 10% of modest or upper 2/3 choice carcasses had less than 4/10 of an inch of fat. Genetics are powerful. Genetics exist, not just in Angus, but in many other breeds as well, where we can produce a lot of marbling with a little bit of fat. 8 to 9% of those modest and higher carcasses had 9/10 or greater, which remember was the threshold value we set. Now for some more eye-opening perspective, at least it was for me, a colleague of mine, Dr. Kristen Hales, who is a ruminant nutritionist, but she studies energetics. So in other words, she's determining how much energy are we using efficiently in livestock, okay? So she worked with her former advisor, a guy named Mike Gallion, very well-respected nutritionist as well, and they took a meta-type analysis approach to a whole lot of studies that were done with feedlot data. and they understood days on feed, feed efficiency, and carcass performance associated with those cattle, and then they retrospectively calculated CO2 emission, okay? So what we're looking at in this particular scenario is an extended days on feed, okay? So we're gonna look at an additional 42 days on feed versus a conventional 42 less days on feed in this scenario. So why are we doing this? Why are we talking about this? Because days on feed have crept up year over year for the last many years, particularly when we are in a deficit in terms of cattle numbers. So here are the data. 180 days versus 222 days on feed. Well, of course, we get another 42 days on feed in that scenario. Dry matter intake increased 0.2 pounds, right, in the case of the extended feeding period. Average daily gain shrunk. I think we all understand that the longer we feed cattle, the lower the conversion, right? So we shrunk average daily gain. Body weight, shrunk body weight goes up 109 pounds. Carcass weight goes up 85 pounds. One magical thing is we increase dressing percent, right? Late in the cattle feeding period, we're going to increase dressing percent, the majority of that being fat, okay? We increase that dressing percent 1%. We increase back fat by 1/10 of an inch. We improve choice performance by 12 points or 12%. Yield grade went up 1/2 a unit. Okay, yield grade 4s and 5s went up 10% in that time frame, and empty body fat went up 2%. Well, that may all be gibberish to you, but the long and short of it is in that extended feeding period, we produced 11 times more fat than we produced protein or lean in 42 days. So the fat gain was 11 times the lean gain in 42 days. Let that sit for a minute, right? So the idea is we are at lower efficiencies, and ultimately we utilized 6 times more steam flake corn in that period, right? So it took steam flake corn the first 180 days to meet maintenance fat and protein needs was 42 bushel, okay, 2,357 pounds. Steam flake corn an additional 42 days to meet those same requirements, an additional 633 pounds or 11.3 bushel. That's what we used in addition. That's just steam flake corn. That's not forage, that's not the roughage portion, that's none of the other feed components. That's just the corn, okay? So in that, 13 pounds of steam flake corn a day in the initial period, 15 pounds in the extended period. 1 bushel of corn cost us 4,000 gallons of water, whether that be precipitation or irrigation. We take that, we multiply it by the additional 11.3 bushel, and that cost us 45,000 gallons of water. 1 head. 1. Think about it. And we wonder why we struggle with groundwater scenarios in western Kansas, in the high plains of Texas, right? In water deficit areas where we're feeding the majority of cattle. And not only in the great state of Texas where I live are we stealing our own water, but we're stealing it from Nebraska too, right? Because it's the same water stream, the same aquifer. We have major issue here. And a lot of it is centered around water in these arid regions where we're feeding cattle. So again, just something to think about it. Here again is that 11 times more fat scenario. This makes logical sense, right? The caloric value of fat is 9 kilocalories per gram. The caloric value of protein is only 4 to 4.5. So fat is twice as expensive as is protein to produce, right? But metabolically, muscle is much better at burning energy in this, and we can take the energy to produce lean is at essentially half the cost of the energy at producing fat. Why do I even say that? Well, we just got done talking about red meat yield. So when we increase muscularity in cattle as a whole, we should and will increase feed efficiency. So the feed efficiency for gain will become greater, and we will be hanging more pounds of lean on carcass at a much more efficient rate. That's the point. So there is a huge sustainability opportunity here as well in producing cheaper, more efficient pounds of gain on carcasses if and when we can fix this system. Of course, there's a CO2 message here, an increase in 25% CO2 in those extended days on feed. Okay, whether we look at it on a total animal basis or live versus carcass weight gain, either way we see increases in CO2 expenditure or CO2 production as a result of producing more weight, particularly when it's fat. So then the question becomes, Dr. Dykman, how much fatter can we make cattle? How much bigger can we make cattle? I've listened to Ty Lawrence say we'll make them weigh 3,800 pounds or 4,000 pounds. I think possible, yes. Likely, no. But possible. What these data say, and these are based on calculations somewhat old in 1995, Owens in 95 stated that 36% empty body fat and 1,645 pounds of empty body weight in that study, protein accretion will be at 0. So when we get to that level of body fat, then the animal is no longer producing protein. They're only producing fat in that scenario. In today's cattle market, cattle will continue to accrete fat up to a point. 1,846 pounds of shrunk final body weight is the number that she calculated that says at that level of weight, they are no longer depositing protein on average. So what this says is we can get all the way up to 18.5 on average and still be producing some protein, although it is at 11 times the minus of fat in that extended period on feed. So a lot of things here. Here's something else to think about. Cactus feeders in particular asked her to calculate this. It is 1.9 to 2.1 times more BTUs per pound of steam flake corn or dry rolled corn making ethanol versus biodiesel from tallow. Because, you know, part of this discussion is well, we're just making more tallow because tallow is valuable, because tallow is being procured for the carbon market to make biofuel. Well, what this says is you're a hell of a lot better off taking the corn and making ethanol for fuel. You're 2 times more efficient in making corn ethanol than you are biodiesel from beef tallow. So that's that's not a good solution. And if you talk to a packer, tallow has never truly made $1 in the day of the business, right? We don't need more fat in the packing industry, even when fat is at an elevated level or value because of carbon market. But just between you and I friends here, right? I mean, how efficient do we think it is to make more fat to subtract carbon? It's not, right? We can't utilize a ruminant to reduce carbon to make biofuel, right? So we're being used as an industry as a offsetting mechanism to be really expensive at producing carbon credit so that petroleum industry can subtract more carbon from their bottom line. It's not a good concept for beef industry, right? The priority is in reducing waste fat, eating efficiency, and carbon while increasing red meat yield. So what do we have to do? Increase the propensity of marbling at an earlier and leaner endpoint. The fastest progress to be made here is to get cattle to marble at lighter weights and with less fat. That will happen genetically speaking. The ultimate goal is we have to make those type of cattle bigger, because our industry does need the carcass weight, right? We are dependent today upon the carcass weight to fill orders for beef. So we can't just go in and subtract 150 pounds of carcass weight. What we have to get to is cattle that are going to marble, first priority, because that is beef demand. We have to get them to marble earlier and at a leaner endpoint, and then ultimately at a heavier weight. So take note, I did not say we need to make cattle lighter in the long run. What I said is we need to change the composition of those animals, but only if they marble. And Glenn Tonser and everybody else that's talked to you over the day or week or what have you is going to tell you that marbling drives beef demand. The flavor of beef is what drives it. We cannot subtract marbling. We have to reduce days on feed. We have to improve feed efficiency for marbling. And then we have to improve the overall conformation and consist of those animals.